So Drift is a poster child for category creation. It's like the number one example. Drift is doing category creation. Was that the play and the idea from the get go? Like when you started the company, yeah, we're gonna create a category, or how did it come about?
Yes. Pretty much from the early days, it was part of the idea of starting the company, and it was an insane one, to think that they have the audacity to want to create a category. But the reason that we wanted to create a category was because not because we wanted to create one. I didn't know anything about category creation. It had to do with the change that we were trying to point out to people and to identify and to educate people around was so big, so massive, and that we needed to kind of reframe their thinking from the existing way that they thought about some of the technologies we were talking about, and to do that, we believed we needed to create a new category, and that there would be, we were the only one, obviously, when we created the category, but that there would be tens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of companies over time that would be in that category. Again, not because of having anything to do with us or me or
Mhm.
any of the people involved, but just because that change was happening in the world and we were just the set of people who would like give it a name and give it a term.
And that change in the world, was that something that insight did it develop over the years and you all, knew about it for a long time, or was that like workshopped?
Um, it was workshopped in my brain, I would say. Like for me, at this point of being an entrepreneur and kind of being curious, I think about it in terms of not necessarily what I want to create, but really about what are trends that are spotting trends that are happening, mega trends, changes in human behavior that are happening because of these trends. Obviously, we've lived through, all of us, 100% of people listening have lived through that with this pandemic, right? And so there's a whole bunch of behavior changes, some of them permanent, some of them temporary, that have happened because of this change. That's the most, that is an example that everyone can relate to because we've lived through it. But I was looking at other mega trends that were happening, and when I looked at them and kind of like thought about them and spent a lot of time deeply thinking about them, I thought that everything that I had built in the past, which was largely marketing, solely marketing and sales software, was made for a world that didn't exist anymore. That it was made for a world where the companies were scarce, and because of that they could dictate the sales process and the delivery process and kind of inflict that on the buyer or the customer, because those customers and buyers had no choice. And we were going to a world of like infinite supply, and in that world that we thought the power would shift to the buyer, to all of us, the individuals. And so like that was the observation, and it was kind of like a pretty quick aha moment and being like, if that's true, and if our timing is right, both of those conditions need to be correct for it to work, then everything has to be rethought, reimagined, and we would need to create new categories. We created one, but there had to be probably multiple categories to kind of describe this, and all the software and all the services, and more importantly, the human processes that we're used to would all have to change.
There's an argument against category creation versus tapping into pre-existing demand, which is that it takes a lot of effort to sell your story, the narrative.
Mm,
And you, of course, you guys at podcast, the hypergrowth conference is a
mhm,
whole bunch of, let's call it customer education or telling the
mhm.
story effort went on.
Yeah,
Um,
that was nothing to do with the business, right?
no,
No, we had to educate a whole market that may have impacted, in the long term and short term, the business a little bit, but we had to go beyond that if we were to educate a market. And but I think, like if someone were to ask me about and they do at this point, ask me about category creation, my advice was not to create a category for sure. Like I think what you're saying is what I would recommend to them, which is like the more powerful thing and the better thing is to really focus on an existing category, ideally a very big category that's moving slowly, and try to like segment out parts of it or reimagine parts of it, but not to create a category. I think that's a crazy thing to do. because the category again is not about you willing it to existence or educating your way into existence. It's about really a change that it in some ways has nothing to do with what with you or your product or service.
Hmm. And so it's difficult because it's too expensive.
Hmm. It's too it's expensive, it's painful. You will most likely it's almost like starting a company. You will most likely be wrong
Mm,
because not only has the change has to be true, but your timing has to be almost perfect, right? Because you have to be the first one to or the first, group to really spot it and want to create a category around it before anybody else does, and not too early in the cycle before it doesn't matter. So like the timing has to be right. When we created conversational marketing, like the concepts and ideas were ones that probably had been kicked around for a little while, but like the reason that I knew that it was time to that we could create a category was that we were looking at human changes in behavior around messaging, texting and chat and Slack and Discord and all these things that we use today. And we were looking at the adoption rates, and we were looking at the adoption rates globally. Again, not of our software, just of messaging as a category, user behavior in general. And we felt like, wow, we had gone past the tipping point because we
mm,
had crossed a point where now, no matter your age range or your global location, like people were choosing messaging as their primary communication method over phone calls and emails and other traditional forms. And so then that's the timing was perfect. But like all those things have to line up perfectly. And as you know, in terms of starting companies, you usually can't wait around to get timing just perfect, or
mhm.
spend tons of money just sitting there hoping it's right. You don't have that luxury. And so for us, we were lucky on the timing side, but it took a lot of energy to spot it and to be ready, to be prepared. They always say about luck, right? Like it's about
Yeah.
like you have to be prepared and you have to see it, right, for it to
So
work.
if you had to put a price tag on it to create a category and inform the public at large about the story and so on, what are we talking about here? 10 million more?
It probably cost us about $10 million, I'd say. That's a wild swag. And so like, but in that order of magnitude, it was definitely not a million. It was not 5 million. So, it was greater than five and probably less than 20 if I were to think about it. And so super expensive, right? And
Hmm.
we had to have the timing just right, to be able to
Hmm.
do it. So it's kind
So
of
tell me
crazy.
more about strategic thinking at a time. So you wanted to create a category, you had a story to tell, you made
Mhm.
all these events and lots of content. What else was going on?
For us, my strategy, when it came to marketing at this phase of the company in the early days was that in order for us to stand out, we were going to have to just spend time trying to find and invest in areas that marketers had either were ignoring because they were small and fringe and weird and hard to measure, or had fallen out of favor. Maybe they were old methods that were not in favor anymore. And the reason I was thinking that way was that because we had to disproportionately get amount of mind share in a way that would be as low cost as possible. And like when I talk to marketers all the time, I think like you know that marketers, it's interesting, digital marketers I'm talking about right now, right? And so like most people who would call themselves a marketer would be really digital marketers. And like for a long time, digital marketing has taught us to really focus and put an emphasis on the tools and the metrics and the numbers and the the systems, really, right? And it's more about like operating systems and channels and platforms than it is around marketing in the way that I think about it in the old sense. And the problem with that is that leads to a kind of thinking where and a kind of behavior where marketers are chasing channels and opportunities that have have really good scale, so large audiences, and are really easy to measure, right? Because they have to prove that this thing is working or that they're getting traffic or leads or whatever way or dollars, whatever way that you're measuring it. So you're looking for like perfectly like high scalable, opportunities that are also, easy to measure. And the problem with that kind of thinking for me is that really marketing and standing out and getting your message to stand out is really about looking for arbitrage opportunities, right? Where there is that's basically opportunity in the system. And by the time a channel, let's say like Google AdWords or Facebook, ads or whatever method that you're using, TikTok or this or that, by the time that it's at scale and easy to measure, like the arbitrage has been worked out of those systems already, right? Like those early movers have come in and really made a lot of money or really had a large amount of impact. And now everyone, is fighting for, very low levels of conversion or very low levels of audience accessibility. And so like for us, we went the opposite way of like we weren't going to invest in any of those traditional ad-based systems or other marketing systems that other people are going to do. We're just going to do like non-obvious things at the time that we thought would help stand us out. Like create our own conference, which everyone has their own conference at this point, but we were like audacious about it, and we were like, we're gonna get like 2,000 people to show up in for our first one, and then we're gonna get like 5,000, then we're gonna get like 10,000 in our third year, and it's like, how are we gonna do that? That's for a 1 day event, and we're not gonna have any sponsors, and we're not gonna have any what are those things called? Like those booths, like which I
Hmm.
hate, like the booths, the vendor booths, and we're not going to have any of that stuff. And it's going to be reimagining of this whole thing. And by doing all of that, which was hard and expensive and a risk, that helped us stand out. We're going to write a book again. Lots of people writing books now, but like this was 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago. We're going to write a
So
book. We're going to do this. Yeah.
you were consciously looking at a different way to do marketing that's not oversaturated yet.
Yes. Yeah. And but because of that, super risky. Lots of failures there. We did lots of attacks of we would take over other people's events. We would, by doing crazy things, we would we did billboards in kind of weird and strategic ways that made us seem like we were bigger than we were, and we were like always like punching above our weight in terms of the way that we were able to stand out. We would never join somebody else's event. We would never sponsor another event. We would only do things where we were kind of the center of attention.
And how did the product strategy and the marketing strategy evolve as you started growing? So now you're like 700 people. Once you reach to, let's say, around 100 and so on, like what changed and what remained the same?
I'd say it largely remained the same until we were probably like 500 people, four or 500, maybe 400, if I were to guess. And I think what changed was really um, a lot of people started to emulate, the stuff that we were doing. So then the arbitrage gets moved out of there, like we were talking about. Like we were pretty early on, like doing the very beginning of doing like LinkedIn takeovers right before every company would do that, where everyone
What
in
do
the
you mean by
company,
LinkedIn takeover?
we would like dominate feeds. We would basically have an approach where like we would get everyone in the company, and as we grew, there was a lot of people to film their own videos, like to announcing something, just like not a video of just like them on their phone just walking down the street or just like whatever. And then all of a
Mhm.
sudden, like we'd announce something and it'd be like hundreds of these videos that get deployed organically, right? We didn't give anyone a script. We didn't tell them exactly what to say, any of that. They would just do it out of pure excitement. And, early on, we could take over and dominate, LinkedIn for the day or for the couple of days. And we would hear from lots and lots and lots of people, many of who we didn't know, like, or many of the companies that we didn't know of, like, wow, like what is Drift? Like my entire feed has been taken over by Drift all day, and it was just like we would just create this fury. There's a lot of other things that we did to in order to take over, but you see a lot of companies like doing that stuff now, so the arbitrage is out of that already. We would do, like I said, weird stuff around billboards or show up at other people's events, like SaaSter, which was a big event in our category. and deploy vans that were had, or take over trains. We took over train cars that people were taking to SaaStr, and wrapped the entire trains in drift. And we would just look for weird things like that where it would stand out, even though we spent like a fraction of what maybe someone had spent in a booth, who
Hmm.
was sponsoring that event. And we would just take over the mind share of those people there. And we would always do, like, let's say, wrap the train. We would always do like three things at once, right? So it was just like ping ponging around that person who's attending there, of like drift seems everywhere. The truth is, drift was not everywhere. It might have been in like three places, but like they were
Hmm.
the three places that you were going to cross for sure.
Right. And so you mentioned copycats were coming,
Hmm.
cloning drift or like parts of it,
For
and
sure.
you probably you knew in advance that this will happen. So
Hmm.
what did you do in anticipation, and how were you planning to, and how did you maintain like the premiumness of drift, knowing that there's gonna be commoditization, it's coming.
Yeah, kind of our premise, even from the very day one, was that all SaaS markets, because of where we were in the cycle, would be commoditized, or are commoditized, or we're in the middle of getting commoditized, and that would include our own, right? And so, like, even though we were creating a new category, if anything that we thought was correct in any way, then we ourselves would get commoditized pretty quickly. And so we knew that, we thought that, we believed that, and so in order to defend that, we, again, disproportionately invested, at least for the size of our company, in building brand, because I thought, that would be the only. And again, like, a lot of people now talk about, brand building when it comes to B2B, and like, how do you
Hmm.
build a brand and how do you do that? But like, I'm telling you, there was no one talking about that, 6 years ago. And so, not that I could spot. And so we spent a lot of time, building brand, because we thought we would need a brand, and a global brand at that, in order to stand out the minute, we started to get commoditized. And,
Hmm.
we also knew that we had to, from a product standpoint, continue to invest and to create a platform, because like, any single feature or any single value proposition would be commoditized quickly. And I think that's true. That's true, for us, and it's true for anyone else who plays in the SaaS world today, because we're just. And I've written around about this, and I've published some stuff around this. That I believe that there's these three cycles that markets go through, and that we're like in the third cycle when it comes to SaaS software. And it's like, the first cycle is about, though, the first era is about, like, pure invention, and that we were talking about offline. That was the early days of the commercial internet, right? Like, and so, like, your defensibility, you could have. Back then we would have patents. We would have, we would basically be able to hide behind technology, because through patents or non-patents, because just what we were doing was so difficult for other people to figure out. It was so much work that you could hide behind kind of technology, like a
Hmm.
technology moat. And then you go into the second phase, which we were in for a long time, including, my previous companies, and that was technology. Everyone knew how to do the technology by that point. It was all public, but what they didn't really understand was how to the business models that involved. So, like, I call that the Henry Ford phase, right? That's about factory building. And so, like, are you going to build like vertical SaaS, horizontal SaaS? Are you going to, like, do freemium product led growth? Are you going to do mid market, enterprise? A combination of those three is like, we didn't know things like, what's your LTV mean? Lifetime value. What's
Hmm.
LTV to CAC ratios? Like, no one knew what any of that was. Those terms didn't exist. Like, Saster, Jason, and others who write about that stuff now, like, weren't writing about it yet. And so it was a mystery back then, of like, how you made the unit economics work, and then
Hmm.
how did you, like, segment markets. But now, when we started Drift, and now where we are talking today, like, everybody knows that. Like, everybody knows the business models, what those ratios should look like. And there's tons of public comparables, which there weren't at the time, and private comparables. Everyone knows it. Everyone knows how to do technology. So, like, there's no moats around those things. The only moat left, in a general sense, is like to build an affinity with your audience, like in the consumer, world, and then have those people choose you for whatever reason. over the competitor.
In 2016 or thereabouts, you famously tweeted that product-based differentiation is going away. Act accordingly. Do you
Hmm.
still stand by this?
Hundred in SaaS, 1,000%. It's gone. It doesn't exist. I can copy anything, anyone around the world. Even worse so now, as you know, because we are truly the pandemic has like really fast forwarded this idea of a global, global stage, right? We always talked about that. That was the kind of the dream of the internet, but it wasn't fully true until the last whatever 3 to 5 years, right? And so like now it's really true. And what that means is that you're not competing with companies just around you. You are competing with companies all over the world. They're all on a level playing field now. Your location doesn't matter anymore. And those companies can copy the business model, they can copy the go to market, they can copy the words and the product and the technology that you've built upon. And there's no defensibility left in those.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Uh, Sometime last year or maybe 2020, Drift started using revenue acceleration. So
Mhm.
moving away from conversational commerce as the leading message to revenue acceleration. How did that come about? What we're trying to achieve there?
Sure. And you asked me this kind of going before the beginning of the we started recording. I would categorize this in a mistake category, so we can talk about what we learned from them. That we had created the categories of conversational marketing and conversational sales, right? Because it was more than just the marketing part. We had written the
Hmm.
book in marketing, and then started to go into sales pretty heavily as well, and we needed a bridge. We knew that we were always going to head towards this kind of conversational commerce future, but that again, back to what we were talking about, we had to get the timing just right, and it didn't seem uh, like we were getting there just yet. But we needed a way to encapsulate the marketing and sales side into like a single story. And so we started to develop and create this idea of a revenue acceleration platform, and revenue acceleration being like the key benefit that our customers will get from using our products, whether in marketing or sales. And so we launched that, and we still use it to some degree, but that was, I'd categorize that as a mistake because it violated the rules that I mentioned before, which were uh, that category creation had to do with our problem, not a market problem, right? So that was a drift problem.
Hmm.
Like we needed this bridge, and so that started from like from our own self interest, and it took into no account the this idea of timing, and again a market being ready, those two things having to be true, like, and it did those kind of like we did that in isolation. We did that on our own, and we did that by ignoring those two rules. And so to me, I think it was still useful in terms of like a frame that we could use to talk about ourselves with customers and kind of differentiate. But like in terms of like, was it successful as created in terms of creating a category? No, and I think it's because we violated those rules.
And so, what's going to happen next in this communication messaging arena?
In our world, in the messaging world, I mean, we've just started the beginning of it. Like conversational, this whole conversational world has gone from the when we started up being like one of one to now there's hundreds of companies in these categories, and so the commoditization is happening. But I think the important thing is that it's helping the buyers, right? And so like that is the focus. And I think the like first inning that we've been in has really been focused around the messaging part and the conversation part and making it like accessible. But the second part, which we've been underway and we've been working on, really has to do with like how do we make this intelligent, not only accessible to the buyer, which is the most important part, but also accessible to the company. And so like how do we take action on all of these words? How do we organize all of these words and store all of these words that are being said by our customers? How do we make sense of them? How do we take action on them? in both a synchronous way, like a real time way, and then a non real time way. And so like after the fact, so like that whole thing is coming now, and I think this idea of like building companies having a conversational database, or a conversation cloud will is on its way, and so that's what we're focused on now. Because for the first time ever, companies can not only have those conversations with their customers across all these different channels, depending on where the buyer wants to be, but they can also capture that information, make sense of it, and then build intelligence on that in a way that we've never been able to do before.
Yes, you've said that over the next, excuse me, over the next decade, messaging will continue to eat the world, and in order to survive and compete, enterprises need to flip the traditional model. So, can you elaborate on that?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that traditional model for me, when I think about it, is this company centric paradigm, which we're still in, right? Like we're still kind of like getting our way out of that. And so like all the software that all of these companies that we work with and that we all use as customers use every day to service us were built, for a company centric world, meaning like a company meaning to serve the company first, and what happened to you as the customer or your experience as a customer were not in consideration, right? And so we think all of those tools, whether it's across support, marketing, sales, that touch the customer, that interact with the customer, have to be rethought. And so we're just, we're in the beginnings of not only us, but um, other companies kind of redefining, reimagining this thing. And so you're going to see a whole new type of sales, marketing, and service suite that will emerge over the next, few years. So that's the part that I'm really excited about. And so, like, I have spent, most of my career in the old paradigm before Drift, and like thinking about how we reimagine and recreate all this is going to be is super exciting for me.
So Drift is a unicorn, and you've mentioned category creation, building a brand, unconventional marketing, and arbitrage. What
Hmm.
else would you highlight that was behind this relatively rapid growth?
Hmm. It's the only other thing I would ever say. Well, two things. One would be like, kind of this maniacal focus on the buyer, which for me and for many in our world, no one had ever really focused on. And the second one would be our team and having that ability to continue to learn and learn from the buyer, learn from our customers and their buyers, and continue to have to reimagine and rethink, the way that we build these tools, the way that we market, the way that we go to market. That is hard, and that is painful because that involves, having a constant, being okay with being constantly wrong, and having to redo your work and rethink and re-examine. And so like it's an uncomfortable place to always be in. And the team and our team, currently in our team who helped us get here in the past have been absolutely, phenomenal, to me, to have that low ego, because the ego is the killer when it comes to learning.
And what are you banking on today to reach your next milestone?
People. It's the the only thing you can bank on is people. And so like, and that's where I spend all my time trying to figure out, having the right people for the right phase. And there are people that are the right people, and they were the right people for a different phase or maybe the next phase. And so just getting that
Hmm.
right is a constant, this, you run companies, like it's a constant, cycle of
Hmm.
learning and changing. And it doesn't, those changes that happen, on both sides aren't because the company's bad necessarily, or the people are bad, or like, whatever. It's not nefarious. It's just like there's different phases, and there are people who enjoy, working in a certain phase or a certain type of company who might not love the next, part of the journey, and might be better off, might like being a solo entrepreneur or might like starting their own business or joining a smaller business, or joining a bigger business depending on what they like. And so like I think we spend so much time in all our companies kind of dispelling, like these crazy ideas about things being more nefarious than they really are. I think what people want, what we all want as humans, are very simple things, and they're not. There's not. There's not much more to it.